and welcome to Badger Talks Live Quick Picks, which brings exciting happenings, resources, and talent from your UW flagship campus to the people of Wisconsin and beyond. I'm Caitlin Gruber from Richmond, Minnesota. I'm a second-year PhD student in the Department of Chemistry studying PFAS in Professor Christy Remucal's group. Today, I'm pleased to introduce Christy Remucal, Associate Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering. Christy will explore how PFAS are impacting our surface waters across the state. Associate Professor Christy Remucal leads the Aquatic Chemistry group at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and is the director of the Water Science and Engineering Laboratory. She is a faculty member in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. She holds an MS and a PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering from the University of California, Berkeley, and a BS in Environmental Engineering Science from Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Her research focuses on the fate of organic chemicals, including PFAS, in natural and engineered aquatic systems. Please welcome our speaker today, Christy Remucal.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining me today. I'm happy to talk with you about PFAS and how they're impacting water across the state of Wisconsin. So many of you have heard of these chemicals. You've probably seen them in the news, finding them in the environment in many different places. And I want to start today with the definition. What are PFAS? So PFAS stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. And this is a group of over 6,000 different chemicals. We actually don't know exactly how many PFAS chemicals there are. PFAS have many beneficial properties, and they're used in things that we come in contact with every day. So think about anything you own that's non-stick, waterproof, stain resistant, grease resistant. It probably has PFAS in it. In addition to consumer products, PFAS are used in many industrial applications, and they're also in some firefighting foams, which will become important when I get into environmental contamination in a minute. So PFAS are used in lots of different things. They're around us every day. But of course, there are concerns about these chemicals, and that's why we hear so much about them in the environment. And so someone like me, who's an environmental chemist, studies lots of different chemicals in the environment. And I want to really emphasize that PFAS are a group of chemicals that are really different from any other class of environmental contaminant that we've studied previously. And there are 4 reasons for this. First, PFAS have been linked to a variety of adverse health outcomes, and you can see some of the examples there on the infographic. So increased risk of diabetes, cholesterol, and even cancer in some high exposure cases. And these health effects happen at very low concentrations. So the ones that we measure in the environment are relevant for human health. Second, PFAS can bioaccumulate. And so that means once they're inside your body, it takes time for them to leave again. So that's how they build up in us, and that's also how they build up within the food chain, like in fish, for example. Third, unlike chemicals like PCBs, which are really sticky and found in sediment, PFAS dissolve in water, and so they're going to move wherever water goes. And as a result, PFAS do move freely around the environment. They've been really detected across the whole planet. This is why they're a global contaminant. And then finally, some PFAS are very hard or are highly persistent. So some chemicals like PFOS and PFOA, ones that I'll talk more about in a minute, don't have any known natural degradation processes. And this is why they're referred to as forever chemicals. So these factors all together, the toxicity at low concentrations, the ability to bioaccumulate, the mobility, and the persistence, all make PFAS chemicals of concern. So if they're of concern, what are we doing about them? Well, we're slowly making progress to actually having regulations for these chemicals in our drinking water. And I wanted to highlight this because this has really changed even over the last couple of weeks. So where we are today is that there are really a patchwork of regulations across different states. We don't currently have any federal regulations for PFAS chemicals in our drinking water. So this map shows states that have regulations, and you can see the regulation for Wisconsin. And many states don't have regulations at all, and some have different concentrations, and there's a lot of variability. A couple of weeks ago, the US EPA proposed an enforceable limit for several PFAS chemicals in our drinking water. And this is going through the process of coming up with regulations that we'll finally have at the federal level. And so the numbers here are lower than the current numbers in Wisconsin. So it's 4 nanograms per liter, or 4 parts per trillion for PFOS, and 4 parts per trillion for PFOA. And these are 2 chemicals that we don't actually make in the US anymore, but I'll show you we find them in many places. They're really common, and we also know that they're have toxicity concerns. This proposed regulation also includes a hazard index approach for 4 other PFAS chemicals. Now, I want to spend just a second talking about what parts per trillion means, because these numbers are really, really small. And so that diagram there will maybe help you visualize what these mean. So 1 part per trillion is 1 drop of water in 20 Olympic-sized swimming pools. So the concentrations we're talking about are very small. So what the EPA is saying is that 4 drops of water of PFOS in 20 size swimming pools is what would be allowed that we could drink that. So these are small, very small concentrations. PFAS have been used for decades, and one of the reasons that we're hearing so much about them lately is we're finally able to measure them in the lab at concentrations like this that are relevant. So these are very small numbers, and these are the ones that are important for human health. So how does PFAS get into our water, and how does it get into our environment? And that's shown here on this diagram. So PFAS might be released from an industrial process that uses those chemicals. Similarly, we often could find PFAS in landfill leachate. So if you think about, you're going to throw out your Teflon pan, it goes to the landfill. The water that flows through that landfill could have PFAS in it. These waste streams are going to be sent to a wastewater treatment plant. Wastewater treatment plants are not a source of PFAS. They don't use these chemicals, but they're also not designed to remove them either. And so that means that PFAS that come in the influent are going to come out on the other end. And that can happen in a few different ways. So the treated water here in the upper Midwest is going to be discharged usually to a lake or a river. And then we also have solids that need to be used. So the sludge might go back to the landfill, and that sort of completes that loop. We also have biosolids, which are produced during wastewater treatment. Biosolids contain a lot of nutrients, and here in Wisconsin, these are often land applied as fertilizer, which is a really great way of recycling nutrients. But if they have PFAS in it, that can be a problem. So wastewater treatment plants can sort of disperse these chemicals further in the environment. One big thing not on this diagram is the use of PFAS-containing firefighting foams. So certain firefighting foams, aqueous film-forming foams, or AFFF, so another acronym for you, these can contain PFAS. PFAS-containing foams are often used by the military or at airports, and so we tend to find contamination in those locations. When these foams are used either for training or putting out an actual fire, if the foams are not contained, this is a really efficient way of getting a lot of PFAS into the environment. All right, so what happens to these chemicals? I don't want to get too much into the chemistry here, of course, but I just wanted to put up one structure for PFOS just to talk about how someone like me might look at this chemical. First, PFAS have this dual nature. So the part circled in blue is lipophilic, that long carbon backbone. This is going to make these chemicals more sticky. They're going to sorb to sediment. They're going to be taken up by biota like fish. But the part in red, the other end of the chemical, is the complete opposite. It's hydrophilic. And this is going to help it dissolve in water. And this dual nature of PFAS is one of the things that makes them really great for all those consumer products, because they can repel both grease and water, for example. But it's a problem because in the environment, it means these chemicals really can be found everywhere. So they're going to be found in fish. We're seeing increasing numbers of fish advisories for PFAS here in Wisconsin. They can be found in sediment. They're also going to be found in water. So they really are going to be everywhere. And this is what we see. Lastly, PFAS are full of carbon-fluorine bonds, the part circled in yellow. The carbon-fluorine bond is the strongest bond you can have in an organic chemical, and so it's really hard to break them. You can see a chemical like PFOS has a lot of these bonds. This is why these chemicals are so hard to break down, and many of our current water treatment approaches don't work on them. So PFAS have been used for a long time. They're persistent, they're mobile, and it's not going to be a surprise then that we find them in many places. And if you follow the news here, we see PFAS is being found across the state. This map is from July of last year, so there's probably a few more dots we could add on it today. My group specifically studies the environmental fate of these chemicals. So we measure these chemicals in water, sediment, natural forming foams, and ice. And we work in many different locations, including here in Madison, and also focusing quite a lot on our Great Lakes, specifically Lakes Michigan and Lake Superior. I'm going to show just for today a little bit of data from water and around the Bay of Green Bay, up in Marinette specifically. So we've been working on this region because there's a company there that makes and tests PFAS-containing firefighting foams, and there's known environmental contamination in this area. And we're interested in thinking about how these chemicals are impacting Lake Michigan. Lake Michigan and the Great Lakes broadly are an incredibly important water resource. And once these chemicals are in the Great Lakes, there's really not much we can do about it. And so we want to look at how these chemicals are entering Lake Michigan. So we focus specifically in this first study I'm going to talk about around Green Bay. And you can see the red points on the map there that we sampled 39 different rivers around the bay. So there are other potential PFAS sources in the area. So contaminated biosolids were land applied in this area. The city of Green Bay, of course, has an industrial legacy and could have other sources. And then there are several airports around Green Bay, which you can see on the map, that may or may not have used firefighting foam. And so what we wanted to ask was, how important are rivers as a source of PFAS to Lake Michigan? And as I said, we sampled the different points that you can see on the map. So I'm just going to show one slide of data just so you can get a sense of how variable these concentrations are. So this is data we published last year, and it shows the PFAS concentrations in water. And this is just for 10 compounds out of those 6,000 different compounds. I think today we're analyzing 30 some compounds. We keep adding more and more, but these are just a few. But it does include things like PFOS and PFOA, the chemicals that are driving the regulations. So you can see there's some variability. There's one that jumps off the charts, over 1,000 parts per trillion. And this is a ditch that drains the firefighting foam manufacturer. So that's not a surprise that the concentrations are so high there. But we were relieved to see that the other sites were actually pretty low. They were all below the surface water criteria of 8 nanograms per liter for PFOS and 20 for PFOA. And so on a first glance, this was really reassuring for us to see that in general, the concentrations aren't really elevated. And this is good. We often focus on the sites that are really high, the hot spots, and this is important for protecting human and ecosystem health in those locations. Like, you would not want to eat fish that were in the ditch that has really high PFAS in it. However, if we go back to our question and we're thinking about, what if our goal is preventing PFAS from going into the Great Lakes? Do we just focus on that one hot spot, the one that's really high, or do we need to jump out or think about things a little bit differently? And so we looked at this data in a different way, and we did a mass balance, which is good engineering to always do a mass balance. And what we did was we combined the concentrations we measured with the discharge, or the amount of water that's in each river. And we were able to figure out how many grams per day each of these rivers was putting into Lake Michigan. And the takeaway is that size matters. So 3 large rivers, the Fox, the Menominee, and the Peshtigo, put in 2/3 of the tributary loading of PFAS to Green Bay every day. Those rivers did not have very high concentrations, but they have so much water that they're actually a really important source. And so when we think about protecting the Great Lakes, we need to think about these large rivers as well as the hot spots, like the ditch that I pointed out earlier. I'm not going to get too much into our most recent work, which came out earlier this year, but we also found some follow-up work in the region that contaminated groundwater is also a very important source of PFAS to Lake Michigan. And that's maybe a little bit harder to think about remediation or think about how to prevent that from getting into the Great Lakes. So I want to end a little bit on what can we do? What are we doing? And, if you're concerned about having PFAS in your water, or you're living in a place that has PFAS, it's important to know that there are existing water treatment technologies that can remove these chemicals from your drinking water. Ingestion is the most important route of exposure. So drinking water is really important to consider. So granular activated carbon is the most commonly used treatment approach. This is basically like a really big Brita filter that's the most commonly used. Ion exchange also works, as does reverse osmosis, which is a membrane-based process. These technologies can be done at the municipal scale. So there are some cities in Wisconsin that are using these things or moving in that direction. They can also be done at the home scale. I do want to emphasize that if you're thinking about using these filters at your home, it's really important to follow manufacturer recommendations and replace them regularly. You can't just leave them forever because that can cause other problems. So that's something to keep in mind if you do go down that road. These approaches do work, but they don't destroy the chemicals. So, you end up with your contaminated filter at the end that goes back to the landfill. And so, this is a really active area of research right now. We're making really good progress in coming up with destructive technologies for PFAS, but we're not quite there yet. But these approaches will work in the meantime to make the water safe to drink. And so I'm going to leave you now with a few resources. There's a QR code to a video from some of our PFAS foam work that's going on. If you're interested in looking for products that don't have PFAS, there are many resources out there. I put one link there. And then if you're here in Madison, that's a great link. And then the DNR webpage has a lot of information as well. And so I'm going to wrap it up there. Thank you very much for tuning in. You can post any question in the Badger Talks Facebook group, and we'll be happy to answer them there. Thank you very much.
Thank you for watching this Badger Talks live event produced by the University of Wisconsin-Madison through UW Connects Outreach and the Office of State Relations. Follow us on Facebook and YouTube to see the library of past recorded talks. Please visit badgertalks.wisc.edu to see the schedule of upcoming talks, sign up for the Badger Talks email list, and search the roster of over 400 UW experts who are available to give talks on important issues in your Wisconsin community.